Thank you, and we're very glad to be here today. My name is Mads Lippergren. I work in the Danish Ministry of Finance's Center for Climate, Green Economy and the EU. And first of all, I would like to just give you the big picture of why we are here today. We, at the COP, we have seen countries, organizations coming forward with ambitious targets, ambitious pledges, and it is hugely encouraging to see the momentum at work here. And we really hope for a good result that will keep the 1.5 degree target within reach. However, one thing is committing to ambitious goals and pledges, but of course the real test will be how ambition is turned into concrete action. And for many of you, those working in government or working with policy, on Monday morning, you will be back from the COP, and on your desk will be the task of how will we deliver on what has been promised today. And for one thing is certain is that for everyone wanting to drive effective policies through in a domestic setting, you need your finance ministry on board to get things moving. So we're here today to give a sense of how we're taking this forward. Many know the role of finance ministries. Of course, we sit on the public purse, but finance ministries also have a key role to play in assessing policy options, in cross-government coordination, and assessing the costs and benefits of different policy options. And traditionally, finance ministries have been focused on economic and fiscal effects, but we are increasingly taking climate change consideration to heart. It's becoming a very, very central part of what we're doing. We're doing it in the Nordic countries, we're doing it globally, and we hope to give you a sense of this. So with us we have, from the Helsinki hub, we have Dr. Sara Tamminen from the Finnish Fund Sitra, and I have my colleague Jesper here. I will first give you a brief introduction, and then I will introduce the two. So, today this is what we're covering, and I'll go straight into the introduction here. Let me just, before we go into the nuts and bolts of what we're doing in the Finance Ministry, which is what we want to show you today, we need to start with the big picture and the political buy-in. Last Wednesday, we had a meeting in the Coalition of Finance Ministries for Climate Action. It's a coalition of now more than 60 members from countries all across the world, where finance ministers are engaging directly with each other on how they can accelerate the green transition. It's a coalition that is being co-led by Finland and Indonesia, with Finland having a driving role in this. We also have many Nordic countries heavily engaged. Sweden leads on carbon pricing, and Denmark is co-lead on the coalition's efforts to mainstream climate change into fiscal and economic policy making. So we're doing that together with the United States, and a lot is happening on this agenda. So why say this? Because I just want to emphasize the top level engagement from ministers. And it's something, I have a quote here from our Minister of Finance, Nikolai Vammen, who was here last week. When he entered into office 2 years ago, he came with a very, very clear message. The Finance Ministry had to play a key role in the green transition. Climate could no longer be seen as a sectoral policy relevant for a few select ministries. It is a transition that is so fundamental that the Finance Ministry needs to be able to do what it does on economic policy as well. So it's a signal that we've been sending in the coalition. It's something that was sent loud and clear from ministers last Wednesday, and we had everyone from US Secretary for Janet Yellen, Korea, UK, Canada, Uruguay, Jamaica, and others. So it's a coalition that really is gathering momentum. So our bit in the coalition, and what we would like to speak on today, is the green reform model. And that's the flagship project of our minister and the Danish Finance Ministry in terms of building new tools that will allow us to better assess the effect of the climate effects of our policies. My colleague Jesper Svejgaard Jensen leads the Finance Ministry's engagement on this project, and in a minute he will go into a deep dive to show you and tell you what this is all about. From Helsinki we have Dr. Sara Tamminen, who works in Sitra. She has a PhD in international economics and is a leading member of Sitra's team working on climate change and nature. The Sitra is a partner for the coalition, and Sarah has been leading work in talking to finance ministries across the coalition to hear how are they analyzing the fiscal impact of the green transition. So here you'll get a broad overview of how finance ministries across the world are taking this forward. In the end, we would like to provide some time for questions and answers, to hear sort of your takes, and we'd be happy to answer any question you might have. And with that, I will leave the stage to Jesper. Take it away.
Thank you so much, Mads. Hello everyone, and welcome. I'm going to talk about this green reform project in the Ministry of Finance Denmark. This looks like you can't hear me. You can hear me now? I just said hello, my name is Jesper, and I'm pleased to see you are all showing up for this event here. I'm going to talk about this project called Green Reform that we are running in the Ministry of Finance in Denmark. I'll give an introduction to the project, I'll tell some background of the project as well as some of the prerequisites for a similar project, and then I'll give a case example in the end. So, just to start out with the first order questions of this project, really starting with the why we are running this project, why do we care? And the setup is actually pretty simple. When we are evaluating new policies in the ministry, we want to not only look at the economic effects of new policies, but we also want to look at the green effects. So we want to include those green perspectives in what we do in our raison d'être. We want to do this by developing a new macroeconomic model that enables us to assess the climate and the environmental impacts of economic policies, and also the other way around, the economic effects of climate and of climate and environmental policies. The way we're doing this is we are partnering with different stakeholders, both in academia and sector experts, as well as other ministries and public institutions. And to take one step back and talk a bit about the context of this project. So the Ministry of Finance in Denmark is coordinating the economic policy of the government. Traditionally, we are optimizing for factors such as wealth and growth and sound public finances. But in addition to that, we have recently changed the mission statement of the ministry, so that now we're also working for a sustainable economy. This was a pretty new addition to a Ministry of Finance like ours. That is important part of the context. Another important part of the context is the way the policies are developing in Denmark. One specific example I want to highlight is a climate law from 2019, which has had has broad parliamentary support, in which we have agreed on a reduction target for CO2 emissions in Denmark. The target is the 70% reductions of CO2 emissions in 2030 compared to 1990 level. But since we are Ministry of Finance trying to optimize for different factors at the same time, we are really in need of a tool where we can compare the relevant key indicators to make sure that we are heading in the right directions for all these goals at the same time. In the climate law, it not only states that we have a reduction target, but it also states that we want to achieve this target in a manner that's socially balanced and where we maintain the competitiveness of businesses in Denmark and so on. As a project background, here's a timeline of what we are doing. The project started out in 2016-17 as a research project at the University of Copenhagen with a modeling group, DREAM. And we had they were collaborating together with universities, the University of Copenhagen and Aarhus University. Then in 2019, the Ministry of Finance got involved in the project. We both came along with funding to the project, but also expanded the organizational setup of the project. So we established a board of directors with representatives from different ministries and Statistics Denmark and other public institutions. So the project went from being a academic project to a project that's more integrated in the central administration. Now we are heading towards the end of 2021, and we've really gone into the phase of testing and improving and trying to implement the model. We do this as we have a goal of putting the model to use in some certain areas, in some selected areas during next year. Speaking of the stakeholders and how we work with them, the way we think about it is they come in three different groups as illustrated here. So we have a certain part of stakeholders in the top here that are deeply engaged in the model development. So the dream group are the ones that are actually writing the code, writing up the equation in a language called GAMS, and they're collaborating closely with universities. There's a number of PhD students that are engaged in the project as well, and they are developing new ways of, for example, modeling the energy sector in a macroeconomic model like this. Then we have the other type of stakeholders here in the bottom right corner, which delivers some of the data for the model. The model is built on, it's an empirical model, so it builds on national accounts data, which the owners of that is Statistics Denmark. They also have data on emissions in Denmark and different energy uses. This is, of course, very important for the model because it's only as good as the data that you put into it. Another important contributor here is the Danish Energy Agency. One thing they do is they develop technology catalogs. This is basically a catalog describing different technologies, the cost of technologies, the reduction potentials, and then these potentials and the cost at different points in time. So in this way, this enables us to put technological change into a macroeconomic model. That is not, let's say it's not the usual way of doing that, or traditionally we have not been able to do this. So this is like a new addition to the model. And then down here, in the bottom left corners, we have stakeholders as ourselves, the Ministry of Finance, which are the users of the model. The project is organized around the principle of openness, so we want to include a broad set of stakeholders. We want to include them deeply so they can provide actual input and are heard throughout the process. And we also want to make the model publicly available when it's ready for being put into use. In addition to just our own ministry, therefore we also have multiple other ministries which we invite to provide input to the project, and also as an example the Danish Climate Council, which is an independent council that evaluates the climate policies of the government. As an example of how we work with stakeholders, last week, actually exactly a week ago, we hosted a user group meeting in the Ministry of Finance where we invited some 20-25 economists over from different ministries to come in and actually try to install this new model on their computers and try to run it themselves. I personally like the fact that we held this meeting in what you can maybe see as a pretty old building. The Ministry of Finance Denmark just celebrated our 300 years anniversary just recently, and right now we are in a place where we can invite some 20 people over and have a let's call it a state-of-the-art IT project within macroeconomic modeling and try it out on their own computers, running it on their own laptops. Hosting a meeting like this really have two purposes. First of all, we want to get input from the actual users of the model to how the model should run and how you're supposed to use it, but also to get input in terms of both how to use it, but then also support them in actually using it. So we had like a workshop where we were walking around and and giving support whenever they had problems with running the model or changing the code and so on. Here's an illustration of the model to put a few words on what it is that we are talking about. So the model is it's a dynamic CGE model. It has a main model, which is illustrated here to the left. It's dynamic, which means that we can make yearly forecasts up until the year 2100, where each year depends on the other years in the model. The model is modular, meaning that if you're only interested in, for example, the electricity and heating sector, you can take out this part of the model and look at that independently. But all these sub-modules in the model are also fully integrated, so we have a model that covers the full economy at the same time, where you get these equilibrium effects across the economy. This is new in the Danish context, because right now what we have is a pretty fragmented model landscape, where you look at each of the different sectors partially. So you look at the energy sector, you look at the agriculture sector, and so on. Here we're trying to develop a model that can be kind of a one-stop shop where we cover the full spectrum. Some other important features here is that we can calculate carbon leakage also on the different sectors in the model. We can do emissions, we can calculate emissions accounts, so where we sum up all the emissions of different of CO2 and other pollutants according to international standards. And then we also have these features of technological abatement. I put some words on that before, and that is pretty new in in macroeconomic CGE models to be able to model technological change. So that is to include how we expect different technologies to develop over time. The model describes 59 different sectors in the economy. So it's really it's a detailed model describing all the different, or 59 different sectors in the economy that produces different output, which is then input in other parts of the economy. We have 27 different energy types in the model, and they are split out on 6 different energy purposes. So we have a high-dimensional model that can describe the economy with a pretty high level of detail. But at the same time, because we want people across the central administration to be able to run the model, it can still be run on a regular laptop. Since it is a model that spans the full economy, it means that the potential use cases for the model also covers the full economy. I don't want to go into all the different examples, but as an example, in Denmark, we have a goal of increasing the area of organic agriculture. One thing we can look at with the model is how much should we increase the support for organic agriculture if we want to increase the area to a certain extent. Another thing is, what will the effects be if we introduce a uniform CO2 tax, a uniform carbon tax, which I will give as an example of how to use the model here on a last few pages. So, as in a case example, imagine that we introduce a uniform tax of $200 per ton of CO2 equivalent. Imagine that we announce this in 2020 and it's phased in from 2023. We phase out the existing CO2 taxes, and then we oppose it on both energy and non-energy related emissions. Then we get this. With the model, as it is right now, and please note that these are preliminary results, so they are indications only. But what we see is we expect to get a 0.5% drop in GDP in 2030, and we get around 16% reduction in CO2 equivalents also in 2030. These are compared to the baseline, so you can still see a real growth in GDP, for example, but we will get, compared to the baseline, what else we would have expected to see, we get a drop of 0.5%. Just to put a few words on what is going on here, some of the interesting features of the model. One thing is, if you take a look at the investments, you see that we expect to see a drop in the investments already from 2020 even though the tax is not introduced before 2023, this is because the agents in the model have forward-looking behavior. So they will, firms, for example, will see, oh, this tax will be introduced in 3 years' time. Therefore, we will get increasing costs. We will likely get decreased demand. We will have to decrease our activity, and therefore we reduce our investments accordingly. This is also some of what drives the drop that we expect to see in GDP in the left topmost graph, and also the short-term drop we expect to see in employment. This is due to the fact that companies will reduce their activities, therefore they need, especially in the most CO2-intensive sectors, therefore they will lay off people, and we will expect to see a surplus of labor. One thing worth noting is that you can see the employment reaches the baseline level from around 2031. This is because this is a structural model, so we assume there will be a structural balance in the long run. But we get these business cycle events in the short to medium term. And one other comment on that is that this structural level of employment, you can see we get those through the drop in wages. So because of the surplus labor, wages will be pressed down and more people will be employed as a result of that over time. Here's another way to dive deeper into the details here. I don't want to go through in detail, and I don't expect you to be able to read what's actually on the slide, but the purpose is to illustrate these effects. We can split them out on these 59 different sectors in the economy, and we can see how they are affected. And we see that it's the most CO2-intensive sectors that are affected the most by the tax. We would also see that whether a given sector will be able to reduce their emissions through new technology, that really depends on what technology options they have and at what cost they come. Some companies will also have the option of simply becoming less CO2 intensive by changing the input in their production. So for example, switching part of their capital input to labor instead, which is less CO2 intensive, or can be at least. And then we see that some sectors, they will also reduce their output, so they have to reduce their production simply because there might be high international competition in that sector. Maybe they don't have great technological options. Maybe they don't have great options for substituting their input to input that's less, that emits less CO2. So with the model, we are able to analyze these effects on a pretty detailed level, meaning that we can analyze targeted policies, but also meaning that if we do a broad policy like this, we can also dive into the details of how it impacts the economy in different sectors. So with that was my example of trying to do a flyover of both the project, how we have set up the project, why we have started the project, and then also what this green reform model is all about. Please feel free in the Q&A session to pop up questions if you have some, and also feel free to reach out afterwards. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Jesper. I hope that was a useful introduction. There's plenty of questions to ask. We look forward to going through those. But now I would like to pass the floor to our Helsinki hub and Sarah. So Sarah, do take it away. You're going in loud and clear here, but it's all yours.
Thank you much. I hope you can hear me. Please tell me if you can.
We can. We can. And if you can control the slides, you do it. Otherwise, I will help you.
Yeah, I have the slides. See. So, good afternoon to everybody in Glasgow. Greetings from Helsinki. It's already evening here. I'm indeed Dr. Saara Tamminen from the Finnish Innovation Fund Sitra, and I'm very happy to talk about how to analyze the fiscal impacts of this climate transition. And we like to add nowadays that this needs to happen under deep uncertainty. This is work that we're doing indeed for the Coalition of Finance Ministers for Climate Action. So Sitra is one of the institutional partners over there, and we've been helping especially the member countries on aligning their policies in line with the long-term Paris Agreement. So we know already that when all the countries are trying to reach net zero emissions by 2050, it will actually mean quite some changes in our societies. We will see quite some changes, of course, what we know already, that's easy to say, in energy production, but we'll also see massive changes in industry, in buildings, in transport, in cities, and in the way that we're using our lands. So both in the agriculture sector and in forest sectors, for example. And of course, we need to keep all the time the long-term perspective in account, even when we're doing short-term policy choices, so that we can actually avoid some of these kind of bad lock-in solutions. Well, it seems that the ministries of finance, of course, want to and need to prepare for these potential fiscal impacts of this climate transition. So there's some scoping to do basically over there. And in our study, we've been trying to, first of all, set up this context of how the world might look like all the way to 2050, for example, and what kind of challenges we face in analyzing this topic. And then I'll just briefly tell you what we're doing more in detail in the study. So, of course, we know already that most of the fiscal impacts actually depend on what happens in our economies and also what kind of policy options we take. With regards to policy options, we have quite a few of them. We can do carbon pricing, taxes, emission trading schemes. We can do subsidies in various different forms, for example, for renewable energy investments or for negative emission technologies. There's a wide range of regulations that are taking place. For example, a lot of countries are fixing phase-out deadlines for coal. There are standards, for example, for transport vehicle emissions. And of course, we're also trying to do, for example, just information campaigns to advise consumers. What is very clear from the literature is that we will need a mix of policies. We don't have any kind of silver line bullet of just using one perfect policy and that would fix our pathway all the way to net zero by 2050 in any country. Well, what makes this particularly difficult as well is that very often we do know some of the changes that are likely to take place, but in general, we can say that the decision-making environment, especially when we're talking about even 2030, not to even mention 2050, is characterized by what we call deep uncertainty. So we don't actually know what kind of technologies we might get in the future or what might happen and how fast to the cost and prices of different technologies and how well they can be actually utilized. We don't know how consumers might change their behavior from the current behavior and what kind of policies, for example, different countries are taking, because of course we need to account that we're having international trade channels and policies around the world are also potentially affecting your own country over here. Very often we also consider when we're thinking about future that some way we're just having a nice kind of dynamic, smooth transition to the next net zero carbon world. But actually what we're expecting is sudden and non-linear transitions. Well, all of these make it pretty difficult actually to analyze this topic in the Ministries of Finance. See? Can I get the next slide? Yeah. Oh, there we go. We're only looking at this transition. So of course, in addition to this transition impacts, countries of course need to analyze as well what kind of climate impacts they might have or how they need to repair, adapt to the rising temperatures. That's a completely different field as well to study, and there's different methodologies for analyzing that. So what we've been looking is how to analyze this transition to carbon-free societies by 2050. In general, in the literature, it's seen that there's three main fields of drivers. So there's the technological changes, there's policies, and there's behavioral changes. So for example, policies can of course immediately have a very direct, clear impact to the fiscal balance of different countries. So for example, if you set up a $200 carbon tax in Denmark, that's going to, of course, at least in the short term, bring you a lot of revenue. But actually in the long term, it might be that it's going away as soon as your emissions are going away as well. But most of the impacts are actually coming through our economies, what's happening in our economies. And all of these main drivers are having both typically microeconomic level impacts and then also macroeconomic level impacts. And sometimes we also need to consider what's happening in the field of non-market goods and services. So let's start over there actually, because that's maybe less clear. So kind of a bit outside of the typical economic view, we of course do need to account as well that we're having a major ecological crisis. It's not just a crisis with climate change. So of course we know that if we're doing climate measures, for example, the local air might get cleaner. So you're getting less sickness from pollution. And that might mean in some countries that there's of course also a lot less revenue needed in the health sector. But of course, in the transition, we need to also make sure that all the measures, the policies that we're taking actually do not at least harm anymore our biodiversity, for example, in general, and that we're keeping our natural resource use within a safety bound. So these are kind of additional restrictions on what we can do. Well, the microeconomic level impacts are, of course, coming especially from the technological changes and from behavioral changes. So we might see preference shifts, or for example, changes in substitutions between different technologies, and also actually changes in market structures. And of course, these kind of microeconomic level setups are typically the core of, for example, the CGE models that are also used in Denmark. Well, any kind of changes over there, or any kind of changes, for example, in policy, technology, or behavior will also have then macroeconomic level changes. We will most likely see productivity changes, for example. We will see different households having different type of impacts. We need to look at how the impacts are affecting, for example, poorer households versus richer ones. So what are the distributional impacts? What kind of financial impacts they might have, or what might happen, for example, to the value of our assets. Is there stranded asset problems, which are huge in some country? And of course, a big case is that we're going to see structural changes in our economies. We're very clear, of course, and very certain that most likely the production of fossil fuels will go down, and the production of new type of clean energy forms will go up. But otherwise, what sectors are likely to go down and what are going to go up in this transition is not actually completely clear in many of the countries. And from all of these, you can, of course, then get into the fiscal impacts. So we're looking at both positive and negative impacts in the revenue side of the government, and they can change over time, as I mentioned. We need to look at the current revenue items, for example, but also, for example, possible new tax revenue sources. In the same way, in the expenditure side, we will see positive and negative effects. And for example, we need to consider, of course, some of these massive new expenditure needs that we need in order to support, for example, new innovations. So we're trying to not just look at the Danish way, it's a very interesting case study to present, but also how different ministries of finance and research organizations around the world have looked at this topic and what kind of solutions they found until now to analyze the fiscal implications. And now we're talking mostly about quantitative analysis. So basically, the aim of the whole study is in line with kind of culture of the coalition of finance ministers to share information. So we're trying to share information, first of all, on these main impact channels that I just presented, but also on the current studies on the topic and their research approaches until now. Then also on all of kind of different modeling tools that you can use and the trade-offs of the different modeling tools, because unfortunately we don't have typically one perfect modeling tool. All of the modeling tools do have some kind of limitations as well. And then we're looking at the potential wider research frameworks that could be used. So how you use the models and also how you actually set up the practical work. So also in this work, the Danish example is a very nice, interesting cooperation example on how to do good cooperation between the ministry and research side. We've been taking a stock of the current national and academic literature on the topic. But then in addition to that, we've been doing interviews with various research experts and ministries of finance around the world. So there's about, I think, 20, 30 people interviewed. And from the interviews, we've been also gathering some views from the experts who are doing this kind of work around the world on some of the key challenges and opportunities for improvement. And we do have some advice as well from the experts on potential ways forward for the ministries of finance. The study is going to be published as a coalition working paper, and we hope to get it out early next year. Thank you very much for being able to present this, and I'm very happy to answer any questions you might have.
Right, Sarah. Well, thank you very much for this presentation, and we're very much looking forward to the study. Sarah has been speaking with members throughout the coalition, is getting us sort of an overview of the challenges we're facing. Right now, we have time for some questions. So I think I'd like to start off with a few questions here from the Glasgow audience, and then from the Helsinki side. If you afterwards, we'll take a few questions from the audience there. But first of all, anyone here who have a question? There's one over here. Yeah, I have one. You need... We'll just do a mic shift here and see whether it works.
Thank you for this presentation. My name is Kathy Orlando, and I'm with Citizens Climate Education, and I'm Canadian. I'm glad to hear that my country is part of this research that you're doing. I'm wondering, well, if Mia Mottley, the Prime Minister of Barbados, brought up quantitative easing, I'm wondering if that is part of any of the modeling, or is that outside of the Ministry of Finance, because I'm still unclear who exactly takes the reins on quantitative easing. Thank you very much.
Thanks. We'll take one more question.
Thank you so much. Now I'm probably clear. Thank you for a great presentation. Really appreciate that. I was just thinking that fiscal measures and economic principles often go against scientific acumen, scientific theories. So would your study also look into the marginal damage control and marginal cost control things? For example, to say it really like polluters pay principle or a precautionary principle? And what are the trade-offs of that? Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Maybe we start with the first one, and Sarah, would you like to, on the last question to take the word first?
Yes. So with regards to the question on who's actually doing these studies, we actually interviewed also, for example, the Canadian Ministry of Finance. So for you, there is quite some research that is done also within the government, federal government of Canada. But of course, around the world, it depends per country who's doing the studies. So there's, of course, also a lot of just academic and research organizations who are doing this type of studies. And very often, of course, they're paid by the government, but it might be that it's, for example, the Ministry of Environment, sometimes Ministry of Finance. It depends a bit on what you're looking. And most of the times, of course, these kind of studies are based on the long-term projections, which are Paris aligned all the way to 2050. So there is a lot of this climate and energy modeling behind the studies. So the main point is basically that we try to look for pathways that would actually keep us within the 1.5 degrees limit. So this is also kind of answer to the second part. So the main point is that it gets always cheaper to do more emission reductions and faster. So this is the main goal. We're not looking at studies which are trying to estimate some of the climate damage. We're just trying to look at, okay, how can you really try to limit the emissions as fast and cost efficiently as possible, taking into consider as well, for example, that yes, we need to look at different type of taxes, for example, in order to get the polluter to pay, or some kind of regulations in case, for example, the taxes don't take us in the right pathway all the way to net zero by 2050, for example.
Thank you very much, Sarah. And then, do we have a question from the Helsinki audience?
You talked about behavioural changes in your methodology and structure. I was wondering how they were included in the model, or maybe you could elaborate a bit more on the behavioural changes?
Yes, that's it. Thank you. That's a very good question. So behavioral changes are typically modeled within these kind of modeling frameworks. So in economic models, we're having some kind of old estimations, for example, on if you're raising the price of some product by this amount, how much demand goes down, for example, or how people might substitute from one product to another one when there's price differences. And now the whole point is that we have some kind of historic data and historic analysis on this, but we need to do a lot more of this kind of scenario analysis as well, so that we have to take into account that these kind of behaviorals and substitution elasticities, as we call them, or demand elasticities can actually change over time. And we need to be able to look at, okay, what if we might have a drastically bigger elasticity, for example, or a lot smaller one? People just behave in a very different way than what they did historically, and how that might change the economic impacts.
Thank you very much, Sarah. And I think we have time for a question or two more. Yes, gentleman right here.
Hi, very nice presentations. I'm just wondering if you could expand a bit on the validation part of the model, and related to that as well, what is the benchmark to decide, okay, this is the model we're going to go forward? Thank you.
Yeah, so you're actually touching on a quite difficult topic, but very relevant one. So as I said, we're now going into the test and validation phase. And the funny thing is, so we are building a new model that has new features, which means we wouldn't expect to get exactly the same results as the traditional models that we have. So when do we know if the new model that we have is valid, or if we trust the results that we get? The way we go about it is really engaging all the stakeholders that have expert knowledge on the specific areas. So they are invited in and get the opportunity to use and try out the models and analyze the results. So concretely, we would agree on some shocks to the model where that we thought were relevant in terms of validating the results. And in accordance with relevant expert knowledge, we would see, okay, so do these results, do they stem with the best knowledge that we have from empirical research? Do they trend in the right direction? If we have some kind of authoritative results that we should get the same result as, we would of course validate towards those benchmarks. So it's really trying to test the models in different scenarios and then compare it to the best empirical knowledge that we have. But it's a super hard challenge, and it's kind of trying to go systematically about the challenge, so we can go through the model step by step, and then whenever we have a part of the model that we say, okay, now we trust the results here, and then we feel like we are ready to put it to use.
Thank you very much. We are, I think, approaching time here. We will be staying around here, so we'd be keen to sort of go further in depth if you have time here to stay. But we would like to thank the Nordic Pavilion for hosting us, for Sarah in Finland for joining us today, and we want to say thank you, and that's it for now.
Thank you very much.